in Sydney.
Speaking to today and those joining us beyond these walls, it's great to be with you also. Can I also acknowledge that later in the day I understand that the Cabinet Secretary, Arthur Sinodinos, will also be joining you, and he'll be able to answer all the hard questions that you have. I'll deal with the ones up front. I'm sure you'll have plenty of tricky ones for me later. But before we get to that, I'd like to just sort of set the scene with where we're heading as a country, where we're heading as a government under new leadership, and the strong national platform for jobs and growth that we are putting in place. The question being asked of participants at this summit is, Australia has dodged a recession for a quarter of a century, and is its run of good fortune coming to an end? Fairly pessimistic question, if I must say, but a journalist recently asked me when I was in a previous portfolio a very similar question, and they said, is the Great Australian Dream over? And I said emphatically, no, it's not. As our Prime Minister has made a habit of saying, this is the most exciting time to be an Australian, and I agree with him. Australia's economic success over the past 3 decades has greatly enhanced our quality of life, and it didn't happen by accident. It's a product of reforms and hard work and investment and great courage and entrepreneurship of Australians in the business sector, and of course leadership at a government level over many different types of governments. The Turnbull government is determined to ensure this continues well into the future, and that is despite the headwinds that we face and the challenges that are ahead. I'm very optimistic about our future and confident that we can capitalise on our opportunities as well as make them, and to further realise our true potential. According to the Westpac Melbourne Institute Index, there are now more Australians who are optimistic about our economy than are pessimistic. And Westpac's chief economist, Bill Evans, who was here today, rightly described this as a cracking result. But this isn't cockeyed optimism on our part. There is a pragmatic realism to our optimism about our economic future in this country. We are not naive to the uncertainty and volatility in global economic conditions, nor to the need for our economy to transition and diversify post the mining boom. But we back ourselves as a government and the Australian people to successfully and prosperously make this transition. The Australian economy, in particular the labour market, has performed well, and the outlook does remain positive. Australia's robust macroeconomic framework and past reforms are paying dividends. Interest rates and the exchange rate are all working together to support growth and employment. The labour market has been resilient in the face of below-trend GDP growth. Employment is now 2.7% higher than it was a year ago, the fastest rate of employment growth since November of 2010. Resources exports do continue to grow, with LNG exports set to expand massively over the next few years, making Australia the largest LNG exporter in the world by the end of the decade. Meanwhile, the transition to broader-based growth, which is the key, outside of the resources sector, is very much underway. The lower exchange rate has underpinned a recovery in other exports. Services exports in particular were up a solid 7.3% over the past year, supported not only by the lower dollar, but also rising demand from neighbours in our region. To protect our way of life and to improve our standard of living, Australians know that they can't afford to stand still. To increase our productivity and secure our prosperity, Australians know that this can only happen through change, by being agile and by being adaptive. Change that will boost our capacity for growth and jobs, in trade, in new technologies, in creating the right conditions for our businesses to grow. We must back Australians who work, who save and invest. We need to seize the opportunity of the new digital economy to transition and adapt to the new economic opportunities of growth in our region. In the next 15 years, China and India, as we all know, together will be home to over 2 billion new middle-class consumers. China's middle class is projected to increase from around 12% of the population in 2009 to 70% by 2030. As the Chinese people grow wealthier, we have a new opportunity to broaden the range of goods and services we provide. With rising incomes comes increased demand for high-quality meat and produce, creating opportunities for our farmers to capitalise on a growing market. The emerging middle class will also have greater demand for more sophisticated goods and a broader range of services, especially the financial and professional services at which Australians excel. I'm advised that for every dollar we spend buying Chinese goods and services as Australians, the Chinese spend $2 buying our goods and services. There are enormous opportunities for our engineers, our doctors, our accountants, our architects, our financial planners and so many more. We have a comparative advantage in our health services and in particular our social services, especially for aged care and ageing services related to the demographic challenges shared across the region. Australia has an ageing population, but we're not the only ones. The developed world has an ageing population and we're very well placed to provide services in those countries where their demographies have a similar trajectory to our own and in fact in many cases are far more advanced down that path. The proportion of the Chinese 60-plus age group will grow more than threefold, from 10.9% to almost 36% over the next 50 years. The population of those aged 80 and older will expand nearly fourfold, from 1.8% to 6.8%. By 2019, the proportion of people aged 60 and older in China will exceed that of people aged 0 to 14. Coinciding with the expansion of China's social safety net, there are enormous opportunities for our doctors, healthcare workers, health service providers, especially aged care and nursing care, our accountants and financial planners, as I mentioned. And we are the big winners out of this relationship. And in China, our opportunity goes beyond the macro trends. As others around the world focus on what is happening at a macro level in China, we understand because of our close relationship and our strong positioning and the quality nature of the goods and services in particular that we provide, that we can work within those macro trends and we can run that inner track on where the real opportunities are in terms of our relationship with China. During the resources boom, of course, we benefited from our natural endowments, and to capitalise on the next wave of opportunities in China, we will need to be relevant to the changes taking place in their economy as they transition from a production to a consumption economy. We have to ensure that we make and capitalise on our opportunities. And that is why the China Free Trade Agreement is so vital to Australia's future economic growth. The chapter will result in China's removal of numerous barriers to imports, and Australia's service exporters will gain improved access to Chinese markets. These include financial services, legal services, education, tourism, health, aged care. This improved access to market will be equivalent or better than those enjoyed by competitor countries, but we will have to be competitive in all of these areas. It is not surprising then that the IMF recently said Australia has strong institutions, a flexible economy and is well placed to seize opportunities created by Asia's rapid growth and rising middle class, helped by the recent free trade agreements. As we transition from the mining boom to broader-based economic growth, Australians understand that they need to make, and we need to make, the connections between their supplies of goods and services and the local demand in China. For many decades, the Australian people have seen firsthand and fully understood that the growth in our commodity exports and our role in providing the raw materials to support the building and investment that has dominated China's growth over the past 2 decades. And we all benefit indirectly from record high prices for our commodities. With commodity prices coming down and resources investment now in decline, mining investment going from about 8% of GDP to 3%, we need to manage the transition to new sources of growth from different sectors of the economy, and we are. Chapter will underpin a new wave of commercial engagement with China. Just as domestic economies mature and develop from the primary to the tertiary, so too is our economic engagement with China maturing to the services focus of that economy. Currently, services comprise 70% of our employment, but only some 30% of our exports. The majority of Australians are employed in the services sector, and as our growth picks up, it will be a more job-intensive growth than we've seen. Australian businesses need to be able to provide their service to people in China in the same way someone in Hobart might provide them to someone in Cairns, or someone in Sydney was providing them to someone in Perth. We're used to dealing with these distances in our own domestic economy, which suits us well for providing them to customers that aren't that far away. 7 million people in Shenzhen, 9 hours away. 8.5 million people in Guangzhou, some 9 hours away. These are not new frontiers for us, and that's what can give us a competitive advantage. The government's free trade agreements will help attract investment to Australia and make key industries more competitive and increase opportunities for Australian businesses. The historic Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement will also deliver enormous benefits to Australia, including unprecedented new opportunities in our region. The TPP will establish a more seamless trade and investment environment across 12 countries, which represent around 40% of global GDP. It has revitalised multilateral trade liberalisation at a time where there has been limited opportunity for progress through the WTO. The success of the TPP, and I particularly want to commend not only for this but the three other free trade agreements that Minister Robb has been able to bring to a conclusion. Our finest ever trade minister, and I don't think that is an arguable proposition. But the success of TPP builds on this agenda that he has been pursuing. The agreements boost our competitiveness and provide these opportunities that we all celebrate. Collectively, the agreements will provide a significant boost to these great opportunities, and to build on this significant momentum, the government is also working to include other key trade negotiations, such as the Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement with India, and you've seen more recent statements by the Trade Minister in relation to Indonesia. And we're also continuing to pursue tax treaties in other nations that reduce tax evasion and promote investment through the prevention of double taxation. Now, connecting Australian businesses to the world's most dominant and growing economies through our trade agenda, the most ambitious and successful in living memory for this country, is part of our plan to establish what I said at the outset as a strong national platform for jobs and growth in our economy. In addition to opening new markets, the other key pillars to this platform are a better tax system, competition driving productivity, a $50 billion national infrastructure plan, a stronger budget, an even more resilient financial system, enhanced workforce participation, and making innovation the centrepiece of our economy. On the tax system, Australia's tax system was designed in a different era for a different economy. Financial deregulation, the growth of multinational companies and increasing digitisation of global commerce pose substantial challenges to the tax system. It's been many years between servicing for our tax system. Our tax system collects high levels of personal income tax by international standards. High marginal rates and low thresholds mean hard-working Australians are not being backed for their effort under the current system. The inflation tax, also known as bracket creep, pushes people onto higher tax rates as their incomes increase over time. And it is a growing problem that impacts on workforce participation. Next year, those on an average wage in Australia will be in the second highest tax bracket. Over the last 15 years or so, we have had an increase in their wages of just over double, but we've had an increase in their income tax burden of almost triple. And this is not something that backs people to work, save and invest. We also want our transfer system, our payment system, to be sustainable and not act as a barrier to people working. You know you've got things right when it comes to your welfare system and your payment system in Australia, when Australians are always better off in work than they are on welfare. And I don't think we can say that in all cases. The way our personal income tax system and our complicated welfare system interact should not result in the creation of welfare traps, eroding or even removing the financial incentive to join the workforce. We have initiated an open and constructive conversation, which I think is being well received by the Australian community, on how we can create a better tax system, not a bigger tax system, a better tax system that backs Australians who work and who save and invest. We also need to reboot competition policy reform that has languished since the conclusion of the Hilmer competition reforms more than a decade ago. The Harper Review points the way to a new era of such reforms, especially at a state and territory level. These reforms can drive the changes needed at the micro level of our economy, in the public and private sector alike. That will lift our productivity performance and must. These reforms are about opening up the opportunity for new service offerings that increase the choices available to consumers, Competition policy is simply about having more choices for consumers. It's not measured by how many competitors they are, but how many choices consumers have. So it's about the choices available to consumers and to facilitate more efficient and effective ways to provide those services to better meet the expectations of those consumers, both here and as a consequence then overseas, boosting our international competitiveness in the export markets. Competition policy should be guided by the principle of making markets work in the long-term interests of consumers. It should foster diversity, choice, responsiveness in government services especially, and it should encourage innovation and entrepreneurship and efficient investment. Competition policy can be an important driver also of the disruptive changes in our response and the resource allocations that underpin growth in a modern, nimble economy. Policies that strengthen our competition landscape are crucial for Australia as a small open economy exposed to competitive forces that originate beyond our borders. I've always found the Australian economy best, and Australians at their best, when there's a bit of tension in the court, when they really have to make that extra effort. We must be wary of complacency in such a wonderful country, and ensuring that our competition settings are right and tight means that it will, I think, produce the best out of Australian businesses and out of our entrepreneurs and out of our economy more broadly. It is true that the competition reforms of the 1990s, pursued by both sides of politics, are credited with raising the level of Australia's GDP by 2.5%. They contributed to a productivity surge that drove strong growth in household incomes, directly reducing the prices of essential goods and services and stimulating business innovation. Australians need to earn more. They need to earn more with real wage growth. We also need to earn more from the way we're competing on the world stage. The good work undertaken in the 90s and in the late 1990s and early 2000s reinforced Australia's standing as a world leader in global markets where we had a comparative advantage. But important unfinished business remains from the original national competition policy agenda, and new areas have arisen where competition policy ought to apply, and that's why I've put it squarely and fairly in the middle of the Treasurer's agenda at a state and territory level together with the Commonwealth, and that is why it has been linked absolutely and completely to the discussions we're having about a better tax system. Our discussions, whether it's about tax or competition or federation reform, is a discussion about how we grow jobs and how we grow the economy. It's not a discussion about tax, it's a discussion about growth, and it's a discussion about jobs. Tax system changes, competition policy changes, trade changes, the things I'm mentioning are all means to an end. They are not an end in themselves. It's not the sort of situation where you're just trying to pursue some sort of ideological principle. That is not the nature of this government. We are a very practical government that is focused on results, and those results are jobs and growth. An example is in establishing choice and contestability in the provision of human services like health and aged care. These are areas where we think there is real opportunity when it comes to competition policy reform. And this will only assist us more with our growth objectives and our export objectives in these important service areas. If managed well, this can both empower service users and improve productivity at the same time. It is through increased competition and gains in productivity that we will secure stronger growth in the real wages of Australians. You can get a pay rise two-way in this country. The boss can give you more because you've increased your productivity, or the Treasurer can by cutting your personal income taxes. I'd like to see both. The government is committed to working with the states on a comprehensive response to the competition policy review conducted by Professor Ian Harper, and I commend him and his panel on his team and on his report, and the government will be responding very, very shortly, and it will be an enthusiastic response. The government is implementing also our $50 billion national infrastructure plan to unlock our productive capacity, generate jobs and expand business and labour market conditions. A key part of that was the asset recycling initiative introduced by my predecessor, Mr Hockey, in this role. The first agreement under the initiative was signed with the ACT in February of this year, and the second with New South Wales in March of this year. And the efficiency gains through privatisation of the New South Wales electricity network will place downward pressure on electricity prices, with the proceeds from the sale to fund new productivity enhancing infrastructure. That is a great asset switch. from the state government's perspective. And we want to encourage these types of innovative policies and the leadership which we've seen from Mike Baird here in New South Wales. We'd love to see it around the country, and we wish to encourage it by putting our money where our mouth is through the Asset Recycling Initiative. We've also established a $5 billion Northern Australia infrastructure facility to provide concessional loans to catalyse the development of major projects in the north. The financial sector also plays a vital role in supporting vibrant, growing economy that improves the standard of living for all Australians. And we understand this very clearly. The system's ultimate purpose is to facilitate sustainable growth in the economy by meeting the financial needs of its users and providing the stability and security for those transactions to take place. The biggest decisions Australia make in their life, buying a home, providing for their retirement, starting a business, are all supported by our financial systems. And the government charged Mr David Murray with examining how the financial system could be positioned to best meet Australia's evolving needs and support Australia's growth. The government has announced its response to that inquiry in October, accepting the overwhelming majority of the inquiry's recommendations. The government's financial systems agenda will be implemented in stages over the coming years, helping Australia to respond to the challenges and opportunities that the future brings. We also need a strong budget, and our priority is to continue the job of repairing the government's finances. Since 2007-8, the Australian government's fiscal position has deteriorated from surpluses in the order of 1.5% of GDP to deficits in the order of 3% of GDP. But we are making progress. Since coming to government, we have made more than $60 billion in budget savings. If we had stayed on the spending trajectory of the previous government in 12-13, our current budget position over the budget and the forward estimates would be almost $80 billion worse off. Almost $80 billion worse off had we stayed on the same trajectory. Year on year, we are reducing the deficit by around a half percentage point of GDP. And our trajectory is towards budget balance, not greater deficits. Our expenditure as a percentage of GDP will begin to decline next year after peaking, and our net debt will peak next year and will begin to decline after that point. By international standards, though, our debt does remain modest, but by our own standards as a coalition government, we greatly lament the level of debt we currently have. And the fact that, having bequeathed the last government debt-free public finances, we are back where we started at around 18% of GDP when it peaks for net debt. And while interest rates may be where they are now and low, this may not always be the case, and therefore we cannot afford to be complacent about the debt. The government's annual interest bill is also money that could be better spent on the delivery of essential services. The budget will be balanced by controlling our expenditures, not by increasing taxes. Our focus on changing the tax system is about boosting economic growth, not raising revenue to pay down the deficit. That may be the objectives of others in the debate. That is not the objective of the government. Our objective in changing the tax system is to back Australians who work, save and invest, to have growth in our economy and to drive jobs. That is why we would seek to pull the levers around the tax system. Our revenues are forecast to return to the longer run average next year and will continue to be improved by policies that assist Australians to earn more, not to be taxed more. At the same time, we will continue to reallocate scarce taxpayers' resources from recurrent funding spending to the key drivers of growth, including infrastructure investment and measures to support innovation. There's also key challenges in the areas of workforce participation, and we're working to continue to see those numbers increase. And we are encouraged by the more recent employment figures that came out last week. Not going to be too focused on monthly movements for obvious reasons, but the growth in employment over the course of the last 12 months has been extremely encouraging. And in particular, given it was given special mention by the G20 as one of the key goals of reducing youth unemployment, and our youth unemployment today is lower than it was at the last election. Finally, we're also working to encourage innovation and to nourish the entrepreneurship that is critical to the continued dynamism of a modern economy. The economy and the tax system need to encourage and back the innovators to create the new ideas and promote technological change, but turn them into commercialised products. that actually transform our economy and the prosperity of Australians. There has never been a Prime Minister more passionate, more engaged and more knowledgeable on the issues of innovation than Malcolm Turnbull. And he is in the absolute driver's seat on this agenda, supported by Christopher Pyne and myself and others. But he is the one taking the strong leadership on this, and he has placed this as the centrepiece of our economic strategy. The capability to innovate and to bring innovation successfully to market will define our competitiveness and ability to seize opportunities in the fastest growing Asian region. It will be centre stage in our economic policy through a coordinated, coherent, whole-of-government approach, and this will be outlined in the first instalment on this in our innovation statement in just a few weeks' time. In closing, while we cannot control what comes our way, and you're all familiar with what is coming all of our ways, wherever we might be in the global economy, we can control how we respond and how we frame our policies. Our policies, as a government, are designed to protect Australia's national economic interests and back Australians as they achieve their economic prosperity and financial security in a transitioning economy. Australians will not be intimidated out of their future prosperity. While the headwinds may be strong, there are also tailwinds, but the greatest tailwind, I think, is the resilience and optimism of the Australian people. First and foremost, it's about jobs for us as a government, and a growing economy is the best and only real way to guarantee jobs. A job is also the best form of welfare anyone can imagine. And this is necessary for the future and to support the strong welfare safety net that we take great pride in this country and are committed to ensuring remains strong so no family, no Australian gets left behind. Our way forward is to promote growth and build resilience, to diversify our economy so that Australians can face a more complex economic world with their great confidence. It is our plan to build and sustain a strong national platform for growth and jobs in our economy that backs Australians who are out there every day making their way in the world. They're already out there. They're already doing it, working hard, saving for their future and investing in their capabilities and opportunities, as I'm sure will be the great focus of your discussions over the course of the day. Thank you very much for your attention.
Treasurer Scott Morrison speaking there at the Bloomberg Summit in Sydney. We'll be taking you shortly back there. Guy Debelle, RBA Assistant Governor, will be speaking, but basically saying they can't control what comes their way. We can control how we respond. He was touching on issues there around innovation and, of course, speaking about changes in tax, focusing on controlling expenditure as opposed to increasing those taxes. We are actually going to take you back to the Bloomberg conference in Sydney. Guy Debelle is about to speak. Scott Morrison just taking some questions.
Here you use the term post the mining boom. So it is definitely over.
Well, it's moved into a new phase, and I think colloquially, when you think about the mining boom in this country, you think about the high commodity prices that we enjoyed, but equally you think of the strong construction phase that is associated with that boom. Now, the volumes continue to go up in terms of what we're pushing out of the country, but that period of time where it was such a dominant driver of investment and economic activity, particularly in the west and the north, that is something that Australians identify with, and we're certainly not in that phase of it anymore. But we're in a new exciting phase. I mean, I talk about us having an ageing boom, a services boom. There's always a boom happening in Australia somewhere.
And we've internalised that. As decision makers, have investors internalised it, have the CEOs you've talked to internalised that?
Well, look, I think there's a high level of awareness about where our economy is. And that's why I'm so encouraged by the optimism that I'm seeing in Australians and Australian businesses. I mean, we all know in this room, I'm sure, that over the last 18 months or so, we've seen householders consolidate their balance sheets. We've seen businesses consolidate their balance sheets. They're in a fairly tidy position. With interest rates remaining low, householders have been getting in front of their mortgages. That's a good thing. And they're in a relatively stronger position than they've been for a while. They obviously remain very focused on things like their job and their future jobs and what those jobs are going to look like 5-10 years from now, but they also know instinctively that they need to put themselves in the right position to be in those jobs going forward. So this idea that you just sit still, that you've got these global headwinds and these transitions taking place and that somehow you jump in the bed, pull the doona over your head and hope it all goes away, it's just not what we do.
You spend a lot of time talking about the strength of services in the Chinese economy. It's a different type of Chinese economy from really the one that existed since 1978 when Deng began opening it up. But what challenges does a services-driven Chinese economy mean for companies like BHP, like Rio, like Vale, that have been sort of heavily leveraged into this global supply chain that's focused on China?
Well, I think their key competitive position is the quality and the reliability. And you know, when those companies talk to you, they'd be telling you a very similar story. They've built relationships up over many years. They are a trusted supplier in these areas, and they provide a quality of product that sits more at the centre of Chinese demand than on the peripheries. We are not a peripheral fringe player in China. We're in the mainstream of where the real growth is present, I believe. And yes, China is changing. But as Glenn Stevens reminded me not long into the job, an outstanding Reserve Bank governor, a knowledge guy who will be speaking here today as well. But he said, you know, 10% growth 10 years ago is worth 7% growth today. But even more so, I think it's an even better growth for Australia today because we are more engaged, far more engaged than we were 10 years ago. We far better understand. I'll give you an example. A2 Milk. A2 Milk 5 years ago decided they weren't going to use agents up in China. They're going to go up there themselves. I think they now have 5 staff based up in Shanghai. They are building their own relationships, their own contacts. Now, I know they were very, very excited about the chapter, but given they're exporting infant formula to China, I think they are more pleased about the fact that China abolished the one-child policy in China. Infant formula. A great export to China off the back of that decision. But I think that shows where Australia is pitching themselves into the changes that are going in this economy, a consumption economy rather than a producer economy. And we need to better understand that as a country, as a government, but also as businesses themselves. And I think they're doing it.
You talked in your speech about how the exchange rate, a lower exchange rate, has helped with other exports to China.
Absolutely. So
you're comfortable at this current level, 70, 71, give or take?
Well, I have a habit of not commentating on these things. I'm not going to do it here. There are plenty of commentators in the room today who will, can give you volumes of commentary on where these things should be set.
It's your commentary that matters.
Well, my comment is simply this: is that we do have the right mechanisms for our exchange rate to maximise our opportunities. And I know that the RBA is very conscious of the permutations of what flows from their decisions and what opportunities that creates for Australians. But there's no doubt that the stabiliser that you have from a floating exchange rate is doing its job.
Speaking of the RBA, you've just praised Governor Stevens. How much credit does the RBA get for this quarter century of expansion we've had here?
Well, I think they've exercised their independence extremely well. Sometimes at the irritation of Treasurers past, not present, I should stress, but I'm sure there'll be time.
I'll give yourself time.
There'll be time, and that's as it should be. There should be that appropriate tension. I mean, we have great regulators, and they can all do. We can all do better. But whether it's APRA or any of the other organisations, I think it has been the stability and the certainty that the RBA have provided, and particularly over many different governors, but I really do have to single out Glenn Stevens. He has been, the rock star of reserve bankers, if you can actually put those two terms together. He really has been someone I think has stood above the pack around the world, and we've been very fortunate to have his leadership.
So you're going to miss him?
I think we all will, but I have no doubt that whoever steps up into his place will set a new standard as well. That has been our history, Reserve Bank governors, I think. It's a tremendous institution, one in which I rely as much as I rely on Treasury and others. They have a unique insight in the economy, and they're an outstanding institution.
You mentioned tradition. I think with the exception of Bernie Fraser, governors have all come internally. Why would you want to mess with that tradition?
Well, you're not going to get me to speculate on that one.
You've talked about how great the RBA is, what a deep bench they've got there. It's a system that served us well. Dr. Lowe was well regarded by this crowd. What a gift to the financial community.
Well, and not just Dr. Lowe, but there is any number of outstanding candidates, I'm sure, who will be considered in this process. What I do know is that at the conclusion of that process, yes, we would have moved on from one of our greatest Reserve Bank governors, but we will also be in a position to appoint someone of equal measure.
If it ain't broke, why try to fix it? Well,
we're not trying to fix it, we're trying to maintain it, and we have plenty of options. All the options are on the table, a phrase I'm very used to using lately.
My colleague's been receiving some questions from the audience. So, David, what have we got?
Yeah, hi. I think it's an interesting one here from Stephen Koukoulas from Market Economics. He asks, what's going to happen first? Are we going to see a budget surplus or a sub 5% unemployment rate? And do we see a need for easier fiscal policy to help that get unemployment lower?
Well, I think I answered the question in my presentation. I mean, I cheekily said in the Parliament that when will we reach a surplus? Well, when expenditure is less than revenue. And that's still my position. And that's what we're moving towards. And I say it in that way deliberately because I see us getting to surplus not by raising taxes to raise revenue, but I see it by controlling expenditure to get it below where our revenue is. Now, when people say to me, oh, why don't you think we have a revenue problem? I describe a revenue problem as a problem where you think your taxing is too low, that you're not taxing people enough to have higher levels of revenue. And I don't think we have that problem. I think what we have a challenge around is earning. I think Australia needs to earn more. And when Australia earns more, when individuals earn more, when the country earns more, well, so does the country, so does the government in our revenues. And that's how our revenues rise. And that's how you deal with revenue issues in this country. You don't do it by taxing people more perniciously. The high tax club loves to talk about the revenue problem. Well, if the revenue problem is we're not taxing people hard enough or high enough, well, I don't agree with them. So I would like to see both achieved, and they'll be achieved when we've, I think, put the various reforms and controls and things in place. And I'm not one to forecast when these things occur, but I am someone to tell you that what I'm doing to achieve it.
But in the general scheme of things, Treasurer, does Australia really have a deficit problem? 2% of GDP, not much in the global context.
Well, again, I made that point. But by our standards, by the coalition government standards, we don't like to see these arrangements. We don't like to be paying out $11 billion in net interest payments that we could otherwise be spending on important services or the social safety net. The NDIS, for example, the single greatest social reform we've seen in some time, has to be paid for. And from 1920, there's more than a $5 billion gap in the revenue that is needed to ensure that we can ensure that that program is delivered. Now, we will meet that, but there is a $5 billion gap, and it grows over the 10 years that follows. And so we need to ensure that we have a very tight set of fiscal arrangements, and that's what we're focused on. But we're doing it in a measured, in a deliberate way, and I think the Australian people understand that you need to sort of walk and chew gum at the same time on this. You need to keep strong growth in your infrastructure commitments, and we're doing that. But you need to then consolidate your current expenditure around other areas of government outlays to bring it all back into balance in a responsible way.
Now, I understand you've got a plane to catch.
I do.
It was great.
Thanks
to have you here. Hope to see you in DC. Now, yes. I can't promise to cook you a pavlova, and there aren't many good curry joints, but we can probably find a good steak.
I suspect so.
Or some North Carolina or Virginia barbecue.
That would be fantastic.
Thank you,
Look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Treasurer Scott Morrison taking questions.